The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the parched earth of the Wyoming Territory. The air was thick with dust, and the crackle of wind through the dry sagebrush carried an unsettling tension. The town of Rock Creek was still, as though holding its breath. A dust devil spun across the horizon, whipping the loose earth into the air. In the distance, the sound of hooves thudded across the land, an approach that was both inevitable and unwelcome. Inside the wooden walls of the town's lone saloon, the murmurs of the crowd died down as a figure stepped through the door. She was a young woman, her long hair a tangled mess, her once pristine dress now stained and torn from the harsh life she'd been forced to endure. Her name was Clara Moon, but in Rock Creek, she was nothing more than a ghost, accused, despised, and broken by a town that had never understood her. "Stop! I beg you, not like this." Clara's voice rang out, desperation cutting through the heavy silence. Her words fell on deaf ears. A rancher, his face weathered by years of labor in the sun, grabbed her arm with a force that could have splintered wood. The cold, calloused grip of his hand seemed to squeeze the very life from her. She stumbled, her boots kicking up the dirt as she fought to stay steady, but her body betrayed her, too weak, too worn down from months of isolation. The crowd gathered outside the saloon had been waiting for this moment. They had waited to see justice served. They had waited to see Clara punished for crimes she never committed, for the mere suspicion of witchcraft, for defying the norms of a society that had long prided itself on its purity. For surviving a war, for carrying the blood of her ancestors, for loving who she was forbidden to love. "She's been a blight on this town since the day she set foot here," a voice from the crowd muttered. Clara didn't know who it belonged to, but she heard the words. The hatred was palpable, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Clara's father had been the town blacksmith, a proud man who had spent years forging weapons for the army and tools for the farmers. But when the war ended, and the land dried up, the same town that once relied on him turned its back. Her father had died in the saddle, a broken man who never got to see his daughter claim the life he had wanted for her. Instead, Clara had been left to fend for herself, alone, abandoned by family and community alike. Now, she was being dragged toward the center of the town square. The rancher's grip tightened, pulling her with an unnatural strength. It was as if he had been waiting for this day as much as the others. His name was Willard Kane, and in Rock Creek, he was the closest thing to law the land had. His ranch was big enough to hold sway over most of the town, and his word was as good as a signed decree. "Not like this," Clara's voice cracked, but she couldn't summon the strength to resist. The townspeople lined the streets, silent witnesses to her demise. Some looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others stood firm, their eyes full of judgment, their hands gripping pitchforks and rifles. A few mothers held their children close, as if the very sight of Clara's suffering would corrupt them. Clara tried to pull her arm free, but it was useless. Willard Kane's grip was unyielding, his rough fingers pressing against her skin like iron. She could feel the burn of rope against her wrists, the coarse fibers cutting into her flesh. The sign of her condemnation, the brand of shame, was burned into her soul as much as it was into her skin. She had never been a witch. Never. But the town didn't care. They didn't care about the truth. They only cared about their own fear, their need for someone to blame. The whispers had started long before the accusations. The little things, the way she spoke too freely, the way she didn't bow to tradition, the way she had once turned her back on the man they'd wanted her to marry. Willard's horse snorted, dragging her forward as he urged it into motion. Clara's boots kicked up the dirt, and her breath caught in her chest as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just a punishment. This was something far worse. The rope had already been prepared, the noose waiting for her like a trap set by the very hands that had once fed her. But as they reached the wooden gallows in the center of the square, Clara's eyes darted over the crowd, and for the briefest of moments, she thought she saw something shift in the distance. A figure standing still among the chaos, his face hidden in the shadows. It was hard to tell, but she swore she saw him, a cowboy, tall and broad, his hat low over his brow. A man who had been a part of the war. A man whose name she had once heard whispered in hushed tones. "Wait." A small voice broke through the crowd, and Clara froze. She couldn't place it at first, but then she saw the child, a boy no older than 10, his eyes wide with fear. He stood there, his little hand shaking, his voice cracking as he shouted once more, "Wait!" She didn't do anything. Don't do this. The crowd turned toward the child, their faces a mixture of anger and surprise. Clara's heart beat faster as she realized what had just happened. It wasn't much, but it was a spark, a single crack in the hardened silence. A small voice, but one that carried with it the weight of something more. Willard Kane didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the child. Instead, he gave Clara a cruel, knowing smile. She's been judged, boy. There's no turning back now. But Clara's eyes were still on the child, the flicker of defiance still glowing in the boy's face. And in that moment, as the rope was pulled tighter, Clara whispered the only words that seemed to matter. I won't break. Not like this. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the world spinning around her. Was this it? Was this how it ended? With the whole town, her entire world, turning their backs on her? Or was there something more waiting? Underscore 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 underscore. Do you feel the weight of her fate yet? Will the world truly let her fade away like dust in the wind? The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant scent of rain. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir the dust in the air, offering a brief moment of reprieve from the suffocating heat of the crowd. The townsfolk shifted uneasily, sensing something was about to break the quiet tension. Clara's eyes, wide with a mix of fear and defiance, scanned the crowd once more. Then, through the haze of her blurred vision, she saw him. A man. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his figure tall and weathered like an old oak tree. The brim of his worn hat shadowed most of his face, but the harsh angles of his jawline, set with the weight of years, gave him away. The dark leather of his coat creaked as he shifted his weight, and though no one dared to acknowledge him, Clara could feel his presence. The wind shifted again, and in that brief moment, it was as if time itself had stopped. Clara's breath caught, a pulse of hope rising within her chest. Could it really be him? After all these years, could he have come back to this forsaken place? He moved then, not with the reckless speed of a man running toward salvation, but with the deliberate calm of someone who had lived too many lifetimes in this harsh world. His boots thudded softly against the dry earth, and his hand was already reaching for the handle of the long rifle strapped to his back. The crowd parted before him, reluctantly giving way as if drawn by some invisible force. Willard Kane stopped in his tracks, his hand still gripping the rope. He wasn't alone, though. A handful of the town's men flanked him, each one looking to the rancher for confirmation. The rope in Willard's hands was cold and taut, but the rancher's eyes flicked toward the man in the shadows. You got a problem, Cutter? Willard asked, his voice rough, like the scraping of leather against stone. The man, Cutter, as Clara now recognized him, didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. His eyes locked onto Willard's, unwavering and calm, as though he was staring straight through the man's soul. His gaze alone carried a weight that made the air itself feel heavier. No, Cutter said finally, his voice low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. I don't have a problem. He paused, letting the words sink in. But you do. The crowd shifted again, a low murmur rippling through them like the sound of leaves rustling in a breeze. They weren't used to confrontation like this, especially not from Cutter. Cutter had been a soldier once, a man who had lived through the horrors of war. He had seen things that most men couldn't stomach, and when the war had ended, he had disappeared into the mountains, only to return when the whispers of Clara's plight reached his ears. No one knew what had happened to Cutter during the war, only that he had come back broken. His presence now was a challenge to the very fabric of Rock Creek's law. But he was more than that. He was a reminder of the chaos and bloodshed that had ravaged this land. He wasn't some knight in shining armor. He was a man who had lived in the dark, and in his eyes, Clara saw something she had only glimpsed in fleeting moments, the quiet strength of survival. Willard's hand twitched. Get in line, Cutter, he said, his voice thick with disdain. You've got no say here. Clara couldn't breathe. The man who had been her protector, her fleeting memory of a life before this madness, had returned to face the very thing that had nearly crushed them both. But Cutter wasn't looking at Willard anymore. He was looking at Clara. His eyes softened just a fraction, enough for her to see the weight of what he carried. A hint of guilt. A brief flicker of remorse. As though he, too, felt the weight of the rope and the accusation, even though he had been the one to leave her behind all those years ago. Clara's lips parted, and for the first time in months, she felt something stir inside her, something fragile and almost forgotten. Cutter. Her voice was faint, a whisper lost to the wind. Her words were raw, worn thin by fear, but there was a quiet strength in them. Don't do this. Her words didn't reach him in the way she had hoped. Cutter stood still, unmoving, and for a long moment, the world seemed to shrink to nothing but the space between them. A stretch of silence. A long breath between the past and the future. He took a step forward. Clara Moon, he said, his voice quieter now, almost a prayer. I'm sorry. It was the only apology she would ever get from him. The weight of it hung between them like an unspoken promise, a bond forged in the fires of their past, one that neither of them had ever really escaped. But Cutter couldn't bring himself to say more. Not here. Not in front of a town that had condemned her long before he ever walked back into her life. Let her go, Willard, Cutter said, his voice growing firmer, though the sadness didn't leave his eyes. She's not your prisoner anymore. Willard's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Clara saw the anger flash behind them. It was a dangerous thing. He wasn't a man who liked to lose control, and Cutter was no one's idea of a safe challenge. But Willard wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for the shift that Cutter had brought with him. Before Willard could speak, a voice cut through the air, a voice that came from the farthest reaches of the crowd. Let her go. It was the boy, the one who had cried out earlier. His face was pale, his small form trembling, but there was a fire in his eyes now. The same fire that had once burned in Clara's heart before she had been consumed by the weight of the town's judgment. The crowd shifted uneasily again, some stepping back, others taking a hesitant step forward. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Cutter took another step forward, and this time, the rope slipped from Willard's hands, landing in the dirt with a dull thud. I said, let her go, Cutter repeated, his voice cold now, final. The look he gave Willard was enough to send a shiver down the rancher's spine. Underscore 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 underscore. Do you feel the turn of the tide? Can a single man, scarred by his own past, change the future of a town set on vengeance? The wind had begun to shift, growing colder as it swept through the town square. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes wide, her heart racing. Cutter was beside her now, his tall frame an unspoken shield between her and the men who had once ruled her fate. The rope that had once been meant for her neck lay abandoned in the dust, as though it had never mattered. But Clara knew better. It wasn't the rope that would decide her fate, it was the people. The crowd had gathered for a reason, because they had been told who she was, and they had been told what she had done. It wasn't just the whispers of witchcraft that had condemned her, but the quiet fear of a town that couldn't stand the thought of someone like her living among them. I won't be your scapegoat, Willard, Cutter's voice broke through the silence, its rawness carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken regrets. Willard Kane glared at him, but there was something in his eyes now, something uncertain. The years of power, of being the man who made the rules in Rock Creek, had started to slip from him. Cutter wasn't the man he had been expecting to face today. He wasn't a simple cowboy, a broken soldier, or a widower trying to escape his past. Cutter had come back for something more. You think you can just waltz back into this town after all this time and undo everything? Willard sneered, his voice rising with a familiar venom. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife, his fingers twitching as if itching for violence. Clara didn't wait to see what Willard would do next. She stepped forward, her boots digging into the hard ground, a silent challenge in her eyes. This isn't just about me anymore, she said, her voice low but strong. This is about the town. This is about the lies you've been telling. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. Cutter's eyes flicked toward her, surprised by her words, but there was something else there too, something almost proud. She was stronger than he remembered, stronger than he had ever given her credit for. The woman who had once stood by his side was no longer the girl who had begged for him to stay. She had become something else. Willard's gaze flickered to the townsfolk, and Clara saw it then, the smallest crack in his wall of control. The men who had followed him, those who had always turned a blind eye to his brutality, now stood in uncertain silence. They had believed in him, followed him blindly, but now they were waiting to see which way the wind would blow. One man stepped forward. It was the same boy who had spoken earlier, his voice now trembling but loud enough to pierce through the stillness. "She didn't do it. I heard her. She's not a witch, she's just Clara. She didn't do anything wrong." Clara's heart skipped a beat. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope in the eyes of the people around her. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. The boy's words had struck a chord, had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of those who had gathered to watch her execution. The town had lived in fear for so long, it was starting to crack under the weight of its own lies. Willard sneered, his jaw tightening, but he didn't speak. The silence stretched, heavy and thick with the weight of a decision yet to be made. Cutter took a step closer to the boy, his hand outstretched, not to threaten but to steady. "What's your name, boy?" he asked, his voice softer now, a contrast to the tension in the air. "Liam," the boy whispered, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Liam Gray." "Well, Liam Gray," Cutter said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Looks like you've got more sense than half the men here." The boy didn't know how to respond, but the quiet approval in Cutter's words seemed to bolster him. The crowd shifted again, some whispering among themselves, others standing still as though rooted to the ground. Clara could feel the change in the air, could feel it in the way the men were no longer staring at her with contempt, but with uncertainty. For the first time since the trial, she wasn't just a condemned woman. She was a human being. She could see it now, how the town had forgotten its own heart, how it had turned blind eyes to its own sins. She wasn't just a symbol of the fear they had been taught to carry. She was a person, with a past that ran deeper than the dirt under their feet, with a story that they had never bothered to hear. "You can't change what's already been done," Willard spat, his voice bitter and filled with rage. He was losing control, and it tasted bitter on his tongue. "She's a witch. She's poison. And you," he looked at Cutter, his hands clenching into fists. "You've been nothing but a coward, hiding in the mountains while we've been cleaning up this mess." But Cutter's gaze didn't waver. "And you've been playing God," he said quietly, his words like steel against the soft wind. "You've judged her, but you've never had the guts to see the truth." For a long moment, Willard didn't move. And in that silence, Clara felt the weight of the town fall on her shoulders. The eyes that had once condemned her now looked to her for an answer. There was no one left to stand in her way but herself. With a deep breath, Clara spoke, her voice steady and sure. "This town has spent too long living in fear," she said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "It's time to stop hiding. To stop pretending we are something we are not." The tension in the air grew thick, and for the first time, Clara felt something shift in her chest. A warmth, a flicker of light that had been buried deep inside her for so long. The shame, the guilt, the self-doubt, she could feel them slipping away. But Willard wasn't finished yet. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the wrist, jerking her toward him with a viciousness that shocked the crowd. Cutter was immediately there, his hand pulling Willard's away with an almost casual ease. The rancher staggered back, stunned by the speed with which Cutter had moved. "You will not lay a hand on her again," Cutter said, his voice low, but the threat clear in his eyes. Willard glared at him, his lips curling into a snarl. "You think you can stop me?" he hissed. "I don't need to stop you," Cutter said quietly. "I just need to remind you what happens when you cross the line." Willard seemed to hesitate, his chest rising and falling with the rapid breaths of a man on the verge of losing everything. And then, with a final, bitter glance at Clara, he turned and stormed off into the crowd, his steps heavy and unsteady. The silence that followed was almost deafening. It wasn't over, not yet. But the rope had been abandoned. The crowd had seen something they hadn't expected, a defiance that was stronger than the laws they had followed for so long. Clara stood there, her wrists still tingling where Willard had gripped her, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Cutter stood beside her, a silent protector in the shadows. And the town. The town was beginning to look at her differently. Will Clara be able to reclaim what she's lost, or is the struggle just beginning? The air grew colder as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long shadows over the town. Clara stood still, her body tense, the feeling of Cutter's presence beside her grounding her like a heavy anchor in a storm. The town, once full of murmurs and condemnation, now lay quiet. It was as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next moment to reveal itself. Her wrists still burned from where Willard had gripped her, the memory of his fingers digging into her skin like an imprint of the past. But it wasn't just the physical pain that lingered. It was the brand of shame, the one that had been seared into her soul long before the rope had ever been tied. Clara had never been a witch, nor had she ever betrayed anyone. Yet Rock Creek had marked her as such. They had branded her an outcast, a sinner, for no other reason than that she had dared to live differently. Her only crime had been to stand apart, to exist without apology in a place that could not understand her. The brand of shame had been like a silent shadow that followed her everywhere. The townspeople had never seen her as anything more than the girl who had defied their narrow worldview. But Clara knew that even if they had let her live, they would never let her forget. Cutter's eyes softened as he watched her, sensing the depth of the pain she carried within her. He had never seen it before, not in the same way. It wasn't just the weight of being a woman in a man's world, or the burden of being an outsider in a town that wasn't hers. It was something older, something far deeper. "Clara," he said softly, his voice like the rumble of a distant storm. "You don't have to carry that anymore." She turned to face him, her eyes dark with the weight of a past. "You don't understand," she replied, her voice low and tight. "This town, these people, they've already decided who I am. It doesn't matter what happens next. They'll always see me as the witch, the outcast. They'll never let it go." Cutter looked at her, his eyes searching for the woman he had known once, the woman he had loved with a quiet, burning passion. But time had passed, and the world had changed them both. "The town doesn't get to decide who you are, Clara," he said, his voice steady but full of a quiet resolve. "They never did. You're not their prisoner anymore." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind carry away some of the weight that pressed against her chest. She could feel the world moving around her, the world she had once hoped to escape from, now offering a glimpse of something new. It was small, fragile, but it was there. The tiniest crack of freedom. "You're right," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "But what about the brand?" Her voice quivered as she said the word. The brand of shame that had been seared into her skin, her very identity, by the townsfolk who had condemned her. It was a symbol of her dishonor, a mark that could never be erased. Cutter stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. His eyes never left hers. "You can bury it, if you want. Or you can burn it." She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Could she really do it? Could she erase the very thing that had defined her for so long? "I'm not asking you to forget," Cutter said, his voice low and earnest. "But you don't have to carry it forever." The wind stirred the dust around them, and Clara felt the weight of the past settle deeper into her bones. But there was something in Cutter's words, something in the way he looked at her, that gave her the courage to look beyond her past. For the first time in years, Clara felt the stirring of something fierce and undeniable inside her. She wasn't a victim, not anymore. She wasn't the woman who had been dragged through the dirt by a town that didn't understand her. She was something else. She was alive. And she wasn't done yet. The next morning, Cutter and Clara stood at the edge of the town, overlooking the jagged hills and the wide plains that stretched out like an endless sea of possibility. The town of Rock Creek lay behind them, but Clara didn't look back. The weight of the brand, of the past, was heavy, but it no longer defined her. It had been burned into her once, but now she had a choice. "Clara," Cutter said, his voice low but filled with something almost reverent, "I know what you're thinking." She nodded slowly, feeling the tightness in her chest loosen, even if just for a moment. The fire, the smoke, the burning of the past, it was all within reach. The pain of what had happened would never fully fade, but the power to decide what came next was in her hands now. "I'm ready," Clara said quietly. Cutter gave her a slight nod, his eyes softening with approval. "Then let's bury it." They walked in silence toward the small patch of land where they would set the past to rest. The wind howled around them, carrying the scent of earth and dry grass, the scent of renewal. They reached the small grave, the one where the last remnants of a shame would be buried, and Clara knelt down, her fingers tracing the rough edges of the soil. With a single motion, she let go of the rope that had tied her to the past. The townspeople would never understand, not truly. But it didn't matter anymore. Clara was free, free to leave behind the brand that had bound her heart, the weight that had crushed her spirit. She could finally begin again, without the shadow of her former self looming over her. Clara stood up, feeling the earth beneath her boots, feeling the weight of the world shift ever so slightly. The future wasn't clear, but it was hers. Behind her, Cutter's voice was a quiet whisper in the wind. "It's yours now, Clara. The future. Don't waste it." The brand is gone, but Clara's journey is just beginning. Will she find redemption in the quiet corners of this new life, or will the past continue to haunt her? Keep reading to discover what lies ahead. The sun was setting low, casting its amber light over the horizon, and Clara's boots kicked up the dry earth as she walked away from the grave. Cutter stood just a few feet behind her, his gaze lingering on the spot where she had buried the remnants of her past, but Clara wasn't looking back. Not anymore. The wind carried with it the scent of distant rain, but Clara knew the storm wasn't over. It never was, in a place like Rock Creek. The clouds in her heart had started to clear, but a quiet tension remained in the air. There was a long road ahead, and the shadows of the past still clung to the edges of her mind. She couldn't forget what had happened, couldn't pretend the pain had disappeared, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe again. "Clara." Cutter's voice came from behind her, his step steady as he closed the distance between them. "You're not running from them, are you?" Clara didn't stop walking, her eyes fixed on the open land ahead of her. It was vast and untouched, a world of possibilities she had never seen before. She shook her head. "No, I'm not running." Her voice was firm, steady with a quiet strength that had been born from years of survival. "I'm just leaving what I can behind." Cutter didn't speak for a long time, but Clara could feel him watching her. His presence was a reminder of the past they had shared, of the choices they had made. She remembered the nights they had spent beneath the stars, talking about dreams of escape, of freedom. But she had never truly believed in that freedom. She had never thought it would be real. Now, with every step, Clara realized she was walking into something new. She wasn't running from Rock Creek or its people. She wasn't fleeing her past anymore. She was stepping into a life she had always dreamed of, but never dared to claim. The two of them made their way to the edge of the land where Cutter had set up camp. It was small, a modest shelter built from the bones of nature, a quiet retreat where the noise of the world couldn't reach them. The fire crackled softly as Clara approached, and she could smell the rich scent of burning wood. The land around them was quiet now, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Cutter set down his pack and turned to her. "You can stay here as long as you need to," he said, his voice low. "No one's gonna find you here." Clara nodded, but something tugged at her chest. Something deeper than fear or guilt. It was the recognition that this moment, this quiet survival, wasn't about escaping Rock Creek. It was about finding herself again. After everything she had been through, after the pain, the loneliness, the betrayal, Clara knew she had to learn how to live for herself, without the weight of shame. She had buried the brand, but it was the weight of living with it that had crushed her. It wasn't just the people of Rock Creek who had condemned her, it was the silence inside her, the belief that she wasn't worthy of redemption. But now, standing here under the vast sky with Cutter beside her, Clara understood something fundamental. Survival wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving others wrong or rewriting the past. It was about the quiet strength to keep moving forward, even when the road was long and the darkness threatened to pull her back. That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara watched the flames dance in the wind, their orange light casting flickering shadows across her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt something shift within her. It was a quiet acceptance, a realization that she didn't need to escape her past to move forward. She simply needed to let it be, to find peace in the knowledge that she had survived it. The fire crackled, and Cutter sat beside her in silence, his presence offering a kind of comfort she hadn't known she needed. He wasn't the man who had promised her everything, but he was a man who understood what it meant to survive, to live through the things that tried to break you. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice soft in the night, "you're stronger than you think." She didn't answer immediately, her eyes fixed on the flames. She could hear the hum of the night around them, the soft rustle of the wind in the trees, the call of an owl in the distance. The world was vast, and the possibilities were endless. "I'm still here," she said finally, her voice steady, "and that has to count for something." It was a quiet statement, but in that moment, it was enough. It was enough because she had found herself again. She wasn't the woman Rock Creek had condemned. She wasn't the girl who had been dragged through the dirt, helpless and broken. She was Clara Moon, and she was alive. The night stretched on, and for the first time, Clara felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. She wasn't defined by the past. She was simply herself, and that was all she needed. Cutter stayed with her that night, not saying much, but offering her the silent companionship of someone who had once shared her journey. The world outside their camp remained unchanged, but Clara knew that, inside her, she was different. She was stronger. She was whole. And when the dawn came, soft and quiet over the mountains, Clara knew that her survival was something earned. It wasn't a victory, but a small, quiet triumph that would carry her through the days ahead. She would no longer carry the weight of the past with her. It had been buried, and with it, the notion that she was something less than human. The past could no longer haunt her. She had found her own strength. Enjoyed Clara's journey? Subscribe now for more powerful stories of survival, strength, and resilience in the Wild West.